Well, Rick Pitino does not care for your scholarship limits as he adds yet another player to his first roster as the head coach at St. John's in Chris Ledlum. What does this mean for the Johnnies, and what does it mean for the Big East? Let's discuss.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey folks, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part, of course, of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton. Happy Friday out there. I am thrilled to be joined today by Tristan Freeman. Tristan is the site editor over at Busting Brackets, a longtime college basketball analyst. Very excited to have him back on the show. Not his first time here with us on Locked On College Basketball. And we got a great show here. We're going to talk about St. John's, Rick Pitino, Chris Ledlum, adding the player, I was going to say former Tennessee player, I guess former Harvard player who spent a little bit of time with the Vols at Tennessee. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to just talk about Rick Pitino and St. John's in general, what him being back in the Big East means for the conference. We're going to close out the show talking about the A-10 and a couple of coaching additions or coaching changes there and what it might mean for that conference. But Tristan, we got to start with the big news, and it was kind of expected as soon as we heard that Chris Ledlum was actually not going to go to Tennessee. He committed there early after entering the transfer portal really early, as soon as the season ended, goes to Tennessee, spends a few months there. Josiah Jordan-James comes back. Maybe he feels like there's not enough playing time there, enters the portal, and everybody said, look, he's going to go to St. John's. He's from Brooklyn. He's a New York guy. Rick Pitino is going to do what Rick Pitino does. And sure enough, a couple days later, we find out that Ledlum is in fact going to St. John's. Were you surprised by this? Is this what you expected? And kind of how do you feel about the fit for him at St. John's?
Yeah, so I think if you're Ledlum, the ability to come back to St. John's, basically your hometown, compared to likely coming off the bench at Tennessee, as you mentioned, with Josiah Jordan-James coming back, who was a 4-year starter there, then it made perfect sense because a whole bunch of newcomers is basically Joel Soriano and transfers from all over the place, the MAC and Ivy League. So not only does Ledlum have a chance to will likely start there as he come back home, but he's going to be in a national spotlight because all the attention is going to be on Pitino. And if you're a guy like Ledlum who wants to have more of a national role, because let's be honest, you're not going to get too much attention to the Ivy League, the way that they run things, then it's really going to be a no-brainer for them. And, as talked about it before, Rick Pitino is going to use not only every scholarship, but even the walk-ons available because they're past 13. And thanks to NIL, they're now in a situation where they can give walk-ons basically scholarship money with NIL, and he's clearly taking advantage of it, and good for him, quite frankly.
Absolutely. I'm with you 100%. I think this is I get that fans are frustrated when you get a player who commits to your program, who spends a few months as a player committed to your program and then leaves. And I know that there's probably some animosity for some Tennessee fans towards Pitino and St. John's. But with Jordan-James coming back, it felt like, hey, this is an opportunity for me to go start for a potential top 25 team in my hometown or in my home state. Like, that's a really, really hard opportunity for anybody to pass up, and especially a player of the caliber of Chris Ledlum. And now you have him and Joel Soriano that's going to make a really, really solid front court, especially when you have some really high-level scorers coming into the program in Dennis Jenkins and Jordan Dingle. Like, it feels to me like Pitino's, it's hard to gauge how this is all going to shake out because the entire roster is brand new, but man, it sure feels like he's building towards something that could be really, really impressive in New York next year.
Yeah, you have 4 guys who's averaging at least 15 points at the previous spots. It was Soriano average over 15 last season as well. So there's going to be a ton of offensive firepower. And that doesn't even include, the Oregon State transfer, Glenn Taylor, who was a second leading scorer, RJ Louise, who I think felt like a breakout candidate as a sophomore. We'll see how his minutes shake up, but he's someone that can get there. Wiltshire is a top 40 prospect. He's someone that should find a way in rotation. So offensively, there's a ton to go there. I think the one concern, though, is to shoot. Because Ledlum is a career 30% shooter, and that's not really his skill. He's more a face to the basket kind of guy Soriano and the big man, he doesn't shoot at all. So if those two are your front court, then you're going to have to rely on the guards. And Jenkins, he shot 36% at Iona last year, but was bad when he was at Pacific. He's not really a pure shooter. Dingle, high volume, around 34%. We'll see how that translates. Taylor was under 30% as well. So there's not a ton of three-point shooting. So there could be some spacing concerns. And I do wonder how Ledlum, who's a 6'6", he's a combo forward, but he's going to be a bit undersized at the 4. He's a little slow at the 3 when it comes to guard and more natural wings and even 3-guard lineups. So it's not a guarantee that Ledlum's going to be successful at the Big East level, maybe at a high level. He's probably not going to be an 18-7 guy, but if you can get 12 and 6 out of him at the 4 and sort of solidify that position, then that's all you can ask for if you're the Red Storm.
Well, we joke about Pitino just seeming to add an unlimited amount of players, but it does seem to come at least at a little bit of a cost. I know that he's able to kind of make things work with some money tossed out to guys who are walk-ons. But shortly after Ledlum committed to St. John's, or after it was reported he was going to come there, Quinn Slazinski enters the transfer portal, a guy who followed Pitino from Iona, comes to St. John's, ends up leaving the program. There was kind of some conversation about that. I mean, he followed his coach and then ends up leaving. It kind of looks a little suspicious. Did he get pushed out, et cetera, et cetera? But I don't feel too bad for Slazinski because he ends up in the Big 12 at West Virginia. That was announced very shortly before we hit the record button here with Tristan, and obviously West Virginia, a team that is looking for talent wherever they can find it after a distressing offseason that led to them losing Trey Mitchell and losing Mo McGee, and it looks like they're going to lose Jose Perez as well, and a couple others as well. And so for them to just get a guy who was a 2-year starter or a 2-year player at Louisville, averaged 11.3 and 5.7 boards at Iona last year, feels like a nice get for Josh Ehlert over at West Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Slazinski, this probably worked out best for you because I think as soon as they added both Louise and Taylor, there's a chance that his minutes were already cut to begin with because he's a former 4-star guy. He didn't play much at Louisville. He was mediocre in his first full year at Iona. And obviously when you have someone like Nelly Jr. Joseph taking over in front court, your playing time's going to be limited. He was good in the first 7-8 games this past season before suffering an injury. So we're still not 100% certain that he's going to be an effective a power conference player. But if you're West Virginia, beggars can't be choosers. Right. They don't have Trey Mitchell, and the power forward position in the past couple of years in the portal has sort of been the least supply. So if you needed a 4-man, there really was never much to begin with, and there's certainly not much now. So if you can get Slazinski, who is a capable, at least body at the D1 level, then you're in a solid position, especially because Jesse Edwards is going to be the focal point anyway. So you just need someone that can soak up minutes at the 4 spot. He's capable. He's likely a 1-year rental guy, assuming he doesn't get the medical red shirt. So West Virginia, it's a good move for him. And plus, I wouldn't be so certain that Jose Perez is gone just yet because his recruitment has been very funny in the past few years. And it's a situation where if NIL comes into play, if you're a Michigan or a Gonzaga and there's potentially a number out there, are you necessarily willing to pay it compared to West Virginia, who certainly still needs some back? So who knows? It could be a situation where with 3 scholarships left to deal with, maybe they can find a way to get Perez back because they certainly could need him on the wing.
They got room, and they still got Creases back. Edwards didn't leave. Raekwon Battle's there. I could see certainly a situation where Perez does return to West Virginia. But Tristan, Rick Pitino has not even coached a game yet, and already the buzz is palpable in New York. Can this team make some real noise in the Big East next season? Before we get into that, though, I want to tell you all about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. For a championship team, it is all about making sure that every single player is a perfect fit. And it's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay's guaranteed fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check mark to know the part will fit, or you get your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay's guaranteed fit is only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, and exclusions apply. All right, folks. Thank you all for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. We appreciate all of you everyday listeners there in mid-July on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. We got fantastic stuff coming your way next week. Some fun interviews lined up with some coaches, some players, all sorts of good stuff coming your way on Locked On College Basketball with myself and Isaac Shade. For now, though, me and Tristan are going to continue our conversation about Rick Pitino, Saint John's, and the very, very exciting Big East Conference. But Tristan, I want to keep our conversation on Saint John's and talk a little bit more broadly about this, everything that has happened with this program. Certainly there was some conflict about firing the coach in the first place and then bringing in Rick Pitino. He's back in the Big East, of course, where he really made a name for himself in the 1980s with Providence. And it really feels like there's a lot of buzz around Saint John's right now. Understandably, you completely overhaul your roster in a way that historically is unprecedented. It's basically impossible to do this until we're in the modern kind of transfer portal era. And now we see this team with a bunch of newcomers. Tough to project what it's going to look like, but we're hearing some top 25 buzz already for St. John's. Some, hey, they're going to finish in the top 5 in the Big East. And look, I think there's a lot of optimism around this team, but I'm looking at the Big East and I'm looking at a UConn team that is still going to be really good, a Marquette team that brings back almost everybody except Omax Prosper, a Xavier team that, lost some talent, but is still going to be good. Creighton's going to be fantastic. Like, I think St. John's has a chance to do some damage, but man, this is still a really good conference. I'm curious where you're at temperature-wise with St. John's right now in the Big East.
Well, I mean, you could be top 5 in the Big East and still be top 20 nationally.
Right.
That's how good the top is for the Big East. As you mentioned, UConn did just fine despite losing Odom Snogo, Jordan Hawkins. They bring in Cam Spencer from Rutgers.
Yeah.
Donovan Clingan, I think, is going to be like everyone's consensus #1 breakout sophomore star. So they're going to be fine. Marquette brings back everyone except for Omax, and his replacement is going to be the Big East Sixth Man of the Year, David Joplin. So they're effectively going to bring everyone back too. Creighton, they bring back arguably, I think, their 3 best players. And then they have one of the best shooters in the country, Stephen Ashworth, going into Greg McDermott's system. So they're going to be good too. So even if St. John's isn't in the top 3, it's certainly going to be no shame. And I think ultimately, if you're at a program, it's not even about where you stay in the Big East. It's just getting back to the tournament and reestablishing yourself as a credible national program, getting back to the tournament, possibly making some noise, not just the first 4, as they did in the last time they got there. So they're going to be fine and getting these big names, especially those who come from New York, because if you have to retain, if you're St. John's, the top local stars. It's already been a successful offseason. And with Rick Pitino, who, considering all the guys coaches you've lost, is top 10 in the sport, there's no reason why they're not going to at least be a contender in the top half of the league.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting about Pitino because he's always been a good recruiter. Like, this has always been a huge strength of his. And there was some question of like, what is it going to look like for him in the transfer portal era? It's different. Recruiting is not like it was in the mid 1980s at Providence. Like, it has changed dramatically. But at the end of the day, like, Pitino did what he is good at, which is brought in a premier amount of talent to this program. And now the question becomes, what does it look like with him as a coach? Because he's also pretty darn good at the X's and O's. Like, that's another element of his game, that's the reason that he's on those top 10 lists, top 5 lists, and I think we look at this roster and it's, you mentioned some of the potential flaws. There's some shooting concerns, not a lot of, maybe some floor spacing issues that could come into play. But I'm kind of curious if for St. John's to have a successful season, like, making the NCAA tournament, is that enough? Is getting booted in the play-in game, like, considered a good year? Do they need to go a little bit farther than that? Like, kind of, where do you see kind of the expectations, which are dramatically shifted from a year ago? I mean, in a significant way. Do you think they're kind of in a spot where it's tournament or bust this year, or were they just happy to improve from last year?
It's tournament or bust because of the additions you made. When you bring in one of the top 4 scorers in the country in Jordan Dingle, you bring in Ledlum this late in the offseason. And had they added Ledlum, say, in April, it would have been a nice pickup, but it wouldn't have been, huge. But now at this point, all the marquee pickups in July get a little extra boost. And then when you bring back Soriano, who was quietly one of the best big men in college basketball, it's a roster, especially when you can give Pitino the respect he deserves. There's no reason why they don't make the tournament. There is no rebuilding process, so to speak. Like, you have a bunch of young guys and you try to improve over time. This is a veteran roster that's ready to win and should win, and you're going to have all the opportunities possible to build up a resume. So if they don't do it, then something went wrong. And when you have Rick Pitino, that's not going to be acceptable. Like, maybe with the previous coaches you had there, you can make an excuse, but there really is none now.
Yeah, I mean, Pitino didn't come to St. John's to gradually rebuild the program. He's old. Like, I mean, he's an older coach. He's probably not going to be doing this forever. I mean, I think he's going to do it until he is absolutely forced to not do it anymore. But again, you don't take over a program in your 70s and get back into the Big East, the conference that you kind of helped, frankly, build into the powerhouse that it became. You don't take that job if you want to just slowly meander through. Like, he took the job to turn this thing around in year one. And the way that he chose to do that was to literally overhaul an entire roster. And that kind of rankled some feathers. I think college basketball and college football are both. I think the fan bases are adjusting to how much turnover there is year over year. We're used to these sports having guys in the program for 2, 3, 4 years pretty regularly, pretty consistently. That's no longer the case at a huge chunk of programs. And coaching changes tends to lead to more turnover. But this is pretty unprecedented. And you kind of mentioned that Pitino's targeting New York guys. And I suspect that part of that is he doesn't want this to necessarily be how it happens every single year. I think if this year doesn't go well for St. John's, I think Pitino might be willing to once again make some dramatic moves. And if he needs to cut 4, 5, 6 different guys or rearrange the roster, he will. But I'm getting the impression that his hope is that this is a 1 year, like, complete reset, completely rebuild, tear it down to the studs, start it over again, with the hope that he doesn't have to keep doing that going forward. Is that kind of the impression you're getting here?
Well, I think everyone in the COVID era has to be old as possible because all the rosters are old. So outside of Kentucky, when you have a bunch of 5-star freshmen, you have to go the veteran route. And these are all guys who have 1 year left. So Soriano, Jenkins, Ledlum, and Dingle are going to be leaving no matter what. Right. So unless you believe that Taylor and Louise and Sean Conway can step into higher roles, then he's going to go back into a portal. And the hope is that you're good enough to where people can willingly come to you early on in the offseason. You can just get them immediately. If you have it, and maybe a Max A. Smith is probably too extreme an example, but those types of guards who's available next offseason, then why not go get them? It's either that or risk going for a freshman in a class where people don't think highly of in 2024. I think next year is going to be automatically transfer heavy because people don't want to have too many of those kinds of freshmen.
Yeah. I want one more question on this topic before we switch over to the A-10 to close out the show. Tristan, I want to talk about Pitino's legacy a little bit and really just kind of him getting back into the Big East. And, there was so many conversation about the death of the Big East, and Louisville obviously played a factor in that perceived death of the conference. I think that the last couple of years have proven pretty definitively that the Big East is fine. And obviously, UConn winning a championship is a huge boost for that, but Marquette was phenomenal this year. Creighton was fantastic, et cetera, et cetera. And now you add this really huge college basketball personality back into the conference. You have, for the first time in conference history, you have a coach switch schools within the conference at Georgetown with Ed Cooley. And it just feels like the Big East is primed for what should be a very kind of dramatic and really, I think, top heavy, but overall really talented season. And it feels like Pitino jumping back into the mix. It kind of feels fortuitous at the perfect time to really kind of mix back in with what should be a really kind of intense competitive Big East season next year.
Yeah, had Dan Hurley not won the national title, Pitino's presence would have loomed large over all of them because none of them had made a Final Four. Like we've been waiting for, outside Shaka Smart with that run at VCU, but we haven't had that big run yet from McDermott. We've seen, Cooley hasn't made that run yet. Hurley, before last tournament, people were wondering, could he get the job done, because UConn wasn't able to even win a tournament game yet. So the coaching hierarchy is as strong in the Big East as it is in the Big 12 and SEC. Pitino just makes it stronger, and he's already a national champion. And now that he doesn't have any sanctions or probations and stuff to deal with, now we're going to see, okay, now that he has, a roster, a power conference roster that can compete nationally, what is he going to do? And if he has a big first year, I don't see why he can't be around for several years to sort of make his mark as truly one of the top tier 4 or 5 coaches in the game.
Well, Pitino's not the only new coach in the Big East. Certainly Kim English taking over at Providence was a big story, with Providence losing Ed Cooley to Georgetown. And I don't want to talk about Providence, though. I want to talk about the school that Kim English came from, which is George Mason. George Mason and VCU, both very, very solid A-10 programs last year. Both lose their head coaches. Of course, VCU loses Mike Rhoades to Penn State. They bring in Ryan Odom from Utah State, whereas George Mason sticks kind of with a hometown guy in Tony Skinn. And you wrote a great article over at Busting Brackets. I'll link it in the show notes for those of you listening right now, and kind of talking about these two programs. Sort of one flew under the radar, and George Mason, they made some nice additions, but it wasn't super splashy. Whereas with VCU, the head coaching hire was a bit splashier, and Ryan Odom, they brought some guys over from Utah State and, had the more successful year last year. But you kind of talked up some of the moves that George Mason made, and I'd kind of love to hear your thoughts on the direction that program is in with the new coach and Tony Skinn.
Yeah, I think at the start of the offseason, VCU loses Mike Rhoades, replaces him with Odom. You could argue that it was an upgrade for them, and the results came where they added not only just guys from a tournament team in Utah State, but a few other big pieces that from the local area. So VCU fans were obviously happy, but George Mason, as expected, was slow because they lose everyone after Kim English is gone. And you bring in an assistant, and even though Tony Skinn obviously has high credentials with the Patriots because he led them to a Final Four, he's not able to just naturally bring in everyone immediately like Odom was able to. So it was slower, but and there are also pieces that don't stick out. Keyshawn Hall was a guy who averaged 4.5 points at UNLV as a freshman. But he played limited minutes, and when he was on the court, he looked really good. He's someone that could be a breakout star in the A-10. You add guards from the mid-major ranks. You look at Jalen Haynes, who's 14 points per game at East Tennessee State. You look at Jared Billups, who's another guard. They have a lot of pieces that are solid, and solid pieces can win in the A-10. It can make you competitive, and the goal for them is to just avoid the bottom. You want to have good momentum. You want to be able to say, hey, we're competitive and be more appealing for the future prospects that can come in. And they've already landed a couple of nice 2024 prospects as well. And assuming that Skinn's going to, keep his ties in the DMV area, I think George Mason won't take as long to get back into the mix as expected, because once you saw what VCU did, I think some would argue that they could be the team to beat, assuming Joe Bamsteele is eligible to play next year, while George Mason is supposed to take a little longer. I don't think it will take as long for the Patriots, and I think they're going to be in good spot. And in A-10, that's going to have a lot of changes going forward starting next season, because the hierarchy on paper has certainly changed.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue, my friend, into kind of what I wanted to talk about. The A-10 had 6 20-plus win teams last year. VCU was fantastic last season, and obviously we talked about bringing in a coach that's arguably an improvement and a team that could be really, really good once again next year. But you also had Fordham, Dayton, St. Louis, George Mason, and Duquesne all had really productive seasons, and there's a lot of talent that left the conference. I know Yuri Collins is out the door. Dayton's lost a significant amount of talent as well, and it feels like there's going to be a handful of really good teams, but it's almost not as certain who's going to be at the top of the pecking order. Do you feel like VCU is still the team to beat? Do you think that there's some other squads in there that might take a step forward and maybe challenge for a championship in the A-10 next year?
Yeah, I think as soon as Deron Holmes announced that he was coming back, he was, you know, I think you could argue that he was even better of an impactful guy than Ace Baldwin, but since VCU finished ahead of Dayton, you had to give Baldwin the A-10 Player of the Year award. But he's back. All the guards were back for Dayton. All of them were hurt. Malachi Smith, Kobe Bryant, Kobe Elvis, they all were hurt throughout the year, which limited what they could do. If they're back healthy and you add RMU transfer Enoch Cheeks, they're going to be real. They're going to be really good. But after them, you look at a team like St. Joe's, brings back all their key guards and Cam Brown, Eric Reynolds, Eric Reynolds averaged 20 a game last year. They're going to be one of the best scoring teams in the country. The question is, can they defend? And look out for a 7-foot redshirt freshman, Chris Ledlum. If he can give them that interior defense, then the Hawks could end up being a team that surprises people. And then Duquesne, from a team that I cover locally in Pittsburgh, they're one of the oldest teams in the country. They have 7 guys who's in their last year of eligibility as a fifth or sixth year transfer. They're going to be extremely old. They bring back Day Grant and Trey Clark, and Trey Clark was one of the top defenders in the league as well. You see teams that aren't usually at the top, but on paper, St. Joe's, Duquesne, even Fordham, who brought in a lot of talent as well and seemed to have this winning culture going on the past couple of years, they're going to be a team that's competitive. And then Loyola Chicago, they were last place in their debut league, but they're a proud program that is not going to be down for long. They had a great offseason with their additions. I wouldn't be surprised if they go from 15th to 4th or 5th and compete for a double bye bid. So it's going to be – there's definitely going to be somewhat of a down year when it comes to the traditional powers, but it could legitimately be a free-for-all with some of these teams that don't normally compete have the best chance that they've had in a long time to sort of win the A-10 and get that lone bids for the NCAA tournament.
A-10 is one of my favorite conferences that I feel never gets enough love. And Tristan, I appreciate that you're out there banging the drum for the A-10, writing about them, talking about them. I think it helps get some exposure to a league that I think is a bit underrepresented nationally. And I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show overall, talk about Pitino, talk about St. John's and the A-10. Always a blast to have your expertise and insight on the show. So thank you.
No, thank you, Andy, for having me. I appreciate it. And we're over halfway there to the start of next season, and it's almost time for preview.
We are almost in preview season. That's a great segue as well, because that's coming up soon on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Not quite yet, but we are getting there. It's going to be a lot of fun to get into those preview seasons. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to make Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day, and looking forward to catching up with you all next week. For now, though, peace out.